Three. Good morning. My name is Forrest.
Hi, my name is
And I'm
Noblin.
joined with Novelin and Jeff. And Jeff today is going to tell us about his research paper.
Yeah. So my name's Jeff. A little bit of background about me. I am a second-year grad student at SF State. For the purposes of clarity, I am not a Middle East focused grad student. My emphasis would be 20th century imperialism and diplomatic history. I took a class last semester on the US and Middle East because this is an area that I wasn't too familiar with. And in the process of doing a research paper for that class, I decided to tie in an interest of mine that I built in my undergrad days, British foreign policy, particularly in the interwar period. It's to me, it's fascinating the amount of double dealing that was going on, the amount of backroom deals and things like that. And so when the opportunity came up to do this research paper for this Middle East class, I thought, okay, well, I don't know a whole lot about the creation of Israel. I don't know a whole lot about it as a state beyond what I see in the headlines and things like that. So I thought this was a good opportunity for me to develop my knowledge on the particular topic through the lens of British involvement. So my research paper is on the creation of Israel as facilitated by Britain, which they were heavily involved in, as my research found. And
the British were everywhere. Literally.
Yeah, leading colonial power. You know, the sun never sets on the British Empire.
Right.
It's quite literally
Very
true.
much did not.
You can, throw a dart at the map at Latsam somewhere, and there's probably a 90% chance it's the British's fault.
Entirely possible. Yeah, that was definitely a thing. I think it's important to specify before we begin that my position on this, going into talking about this, is based on my views as a historian, which is to say that I think it's important in this given climate that we're in right now, with the rather extreme amounts of polarization and emotions and things like that. I think it's important to say that as historians, we need to try to maintain as much objectivity as we can. But
that doesn't mean that we don't talk about things that are controversial. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to talk about anything.
Exactly. We have a need to talk about things. We are not gatekeepers. We don't hoard this knowledge for ourselves and then we parcel it out to, as we see fit. We strive for objectivity, and there's always going to be biases present, whether they're conscious or unconscious. But I think that it's important that we recognize that we talk about these things because it's important to inform the discussion about where things have come from. I think the UN chief, his name escapes me right now, he made a statement in which he said that the events of October 7th did not occur in a vacuum. And that's absolutely true. That's borne out by historical fact.
Nothing occurs in a vacuum.
Yeah, regardless of whether your emotions make you want to dictate that no, that's not the case or whatever, the facts belie that. The facts stand firmly on the assertion that this has been an ongoing thing for well over a century. I mean, as my research has borne out, this has been going on for a very long time. The current generation of people that are fighting and doing all this stuff over there, they were born into this. It's not like this just came about and suddenly. And I think it's important that we state that while also recognizing that a lot of the stuff that's going on is unacceptable. It's abominable. I mean, targeting civilians of any kind, of any belief, whatever, is always a horrific thing. And there's no justification for it. There never should be.
Yeah. Just because people might have legitimate grievances and have valid reasons for being angry, this terrorism violence is not going to solve any of the underlying issues that anyone actually wants solved.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that needs to be said. I think that needs to be championed more often. There are historical facts, they're widely available. There's historical documents that bear out those facts, they support them. A lot of these things are easily available. I mean, our phones are a gateway to the world. I mean, we can access more information through the phone in our pockets than at any point anybody's ever had to access information. The information's out there. We just need to be able to understand that it's there and recognize it for what it is and be able to engage with it. Everything else, the viewpoints, the propaganda, the all the other stuff, I mean, that's all the emotions and everything else. I think that's should be informed by the fact that the research shows that this did not occur in a vacuum. And so there you go.
With a disclaimer out of the way, how about you start telling us how the British are to blame for everything?
Okay. Fair enough.
That's a joke, for anyone who might be listening, that's a joke. Hopefully you get that, but
So there is a lot of truth to that.
Good humor has an element of truth in it.
True, very true. All right, so what I wanted to do, because realistically, I mean, we could be sitting here talking about this all day today and tomorrow and probably through next week if we really get into the nooks and crannies of all the details and everything else. So I wanted to kind of go over the sources that I used, that I engaged with, the ones that provide the most benefit, I think, for me. And then I'll go over kind of the highlights of my paper and, what I talked about, stuff like that. So with that, the sources included An Unpromising Land by Gur Al-Rui. I'm sure I'm mangling the name, and I do apologize for that.
That's inevitable. We're not native speakers of the language. We just have to try to do the best we can.
Yeah, exactly. Al-Rui's work was really informative on Jewish migration patterns to Palestine, the Aliyah, I believe the term is. The motivations behind the different waves, of which they list 5, of which they had different intents and purposes. Starting from the 1890s all the way up through 1936, I believe, when the British cut off legal migration to Palestine. It talks about the early leadership and activities that were going on at that point in time. There's also Redrawing the Middle East by Michael Burdine. This provided a lot of background information on Britain's activities in the Middle East, with a special emphasis on Mark Sykes's involvement, who would be a central character in the developments of what happened in Palestine. Palestine Retreat from the Mandate by Michael Cohen. There's a lot of information there about Jewish migration from the UK and British Mandate officials, particularly. And it also talks about the conflict that was going on between the Arabs and the Jews up to the point of 1948 when Israel was declared. One of my mentors recommended most strenuously a documentary history of the Arab-Israeli conflict by Charles Geddes. This is a foundational book, I think, that contains numerous primary source documents and tracts, all of which are translated into English, which was particularly helpful. There's Second Exodus, the full story of Jewish illegal immigration to Palestine by Ziv Hadari. This provided a lot more background information on migration and the British attempts to stop migration after they ended it in actually 1939. I see my dates wrong here. My daughter is currently fighting with her cat, who it's his wake time, and he's not sure what he wants, but he's sure that he wants it. There's The Zionist Masquerade, The Birth of the Anglo-Zionist Alliance by James Renton. This was very important work to research because it provided a wealth of links between the British politicians pre-World War I and the Zionist movements. There's a lot of detail on Christian Zionism and how nationalism supported the efforts toward the Balfour Declaration. There's a lot of descriptions about racism, stereotypes, how those structured Jews as a racial group that was cohesive and could be negotiated with as a whole for the purpose of imperial and colonial aims, something that Britain kind of dabbled in at that point in time. Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict by Charles Smith. This is another foundational text recommended by my mentor. This book reads like a textbook, honestly. There probably is no better overview of everything that has gone on all the way up through almost to the present, to the time of publication, involving Arabs and the Israelis and the conflicts going on there. And then lastly, there's the Balfour Declaration, which is probably the best source for information surrounding the Balfour Declaration of 1917, through the San Remo Conference in 1920. The book is ungodly huge. It's almost 700 pages. It's like one page shy of 700 pages. But Stein was just
that's a big one.
Yeah, I mean, this was the encyclopedia. I mean, this is just the book to read on that point in time. So, enough stalling, I guess. Let's get into the paper itself.
All right, let's dig in. All right, let's dig into it.
So, within the overarching thesis of my paper, I tried to look at two central questions. The first of which I'm going to focus on primarily because that's mainly where my research and interest lies. The first was, how did Britain become involved in this? And the second is, what were the effects of Britain's involvement therein? So, with regard to the first question, Britain involvement came about as a conjunction of multiple things. This was an intersection of a lot of different factors coming into it. There is Zionism, certainly. There was a large amount of Zionist activity at this point in time. We're talking about the turn of the century into the 1900s.
Okay. I think for everyone here, it would be useful to get a definition of Zionism, because a lot of people here, because that word gets thrown around a lot, and half the time it's being thrown around by conspiracy theorists.
Yep, absolutely. That's absolutely true. Give me just 1 second here. So Vox has a very good article on what is Zionism. That's actually the name of the article. Talks about Israel's national ideology. Vox defines Zionism as Judaism, nationality as well as a religion. Jews deserve their own state and their ancestral homeland in the same way the French people deserve France and the Chinese people deserve China. It's what brought Jews back to Israel in the first place, and also at the heart of it concerns Arabs and Palestinians about their Israeli state. So Zionism essentially is the belief that there needs to be a Jewish homeland. This coalesced around Palestine fairly early on. It was not always the case. There were attempts to create a Jewish homeland in Africa, in another one of Britain's colonies. I believe there are some attempts to engage the Germans on this as well. But it was an ongoing process from about the 1860s onward up till British official engagement of the policy with the Balfour Declaration. So it was been going on for a while. So like you said, there's a lot of conspiracy theories and things like that. And there's also, to be fair, there's a lot of different how would you say, shades of Zionism. There's a lot of different types. It's not like a solid, unified ideology in the way that I don't know, nothing really springs to mind.
Like
think of any
most ideology,
pretty
much every ideology fractures, but try to put a short definition to, or at least my short definition to Zionism, it's what they call, or what many of them call, the national movement of international Judaism. It's their national movement. It's nationalism.
Exactly. And that's a big factor. That is a big factor that came to play into all of this. Like I said, there's a combination of different things that came together. You have Old Testament Protestant beliefs. You have an expansion of engagement by the British population with things like photography, travel literature, things like that. And what that did was that had the effect of allowing people to see about things they'd only ever really read about, or maybe saw a picture somebody else had drawn or painted. Being able to see like a travel magazine that showed ancient Egypt and the pyramids, things like that. That brought stuff home to people in a way that nothing ever really had before. Kind of expanded the imagination, and it allowed people to engage with particularly Old Testament beliefs and stories in a way that they hadn't been able to before. So that was certainly part of it. There's a large part of pre-existing religious bias by British elites, Christian Zionism, the anti-Semitism that was present throughout Europe and relatively, the world, arguably. That certainly had a role to play in it as well. And looking for a way to get the Jews out. The idea of Zionism as creating a homeland for the Jews, it became a convenient means of saying, okay, let's do what we've always wanted to do.
And move them.
But let's make ourselves look good about it by supporting them. And so that was it's a really convenient narrative to attach. The background of nationalism is arising. Let me talk about that a little bit here. Give me 1 second to pull up the page. So, nationalism found its roots in the idea of people being groups as opposed to individuals. And if people are a group, you can identify that group's aims and wants and prejudices and, all that kind of stuff.
Stereotype them
in a way that allows you to engage with them as a whole and kind of dismiss the individual. You kind of take away the agency of the individual and you assign it rather to the group as a whole. That's convenient for the purposes of colonialism, because it makes it a lot easier to deal with indigenous populations or colonized people, because you have a convenient way to understand them. And once you have that convenient way to understand them, you can engage with them on your terms and then dictate to them this or that, and essentially tell them, okay, this is what you guys want because this is what we believe you want. It's very useful.
On the other side, nationalism was a key component for the creation of what we consider a modern state. That there's a reason the term is nation state, and they're so intertwined now, where it's hard, where it takes, it's sometimes difficult to separate the idea that states are not necessarily nations, and nations aren't always states. Like the Kurds, for instance, are like the classic example of considered a nation group. They're the largest nation group without a state of their own, and you have states which aren't really nations. Like, look at the Middle East, look at most Africa. They were carved up for colonial purposes, and so none of them really reflect any real concept of like a nation state. Otherwise, Kurdistan would be a thing.
Very true.
I mean, and also it's important to note, the importance of these creations of nationalist fictions for all different aspects of a society and how a society can relate to others on a global stage. It's hard for specific individuals of a certain culture or society to really do so without that kind of nationalist fiction to really center that. And that is at least part of the motivation for Zionism, is that Jewish people did not have this kind of all-encompassing nationalist fiction to advocate for themselves. And that was at least some of the theory behind the ideology.
Exactly, yeah. It had to be created because it was a convenient way of stereotyping, certainly, boxing people into a nice, neat, predetermined category. I have a quote here by Leopold Amory. I'll just read this entirely from the paper. Perhaps Leopold Amory summed up the first point best in 1917 as a member of the War Cabinet Secretariat when, during a speech on imperial unity, he said, "The whole foundation of nationalism lies in the realization of the fact that there are no such things as the independent individualists whom the individualist ideal postulates. Men are what they are, do what they do, wish what they wish, just because they're born of a certain race and to a certain society. Race instinct or patriotism are as much natural emotions as hunger or self-interest." So the idea here is that nationalism is what he's trying to cement is that nationalism is a part of the self-person. Hunger and patriotism are equally relevant in this ideology because it allows for the understanding of a person, and by intertwining these concepts within a person, you can understand their behaviors, their goals, their attitudes, and things like that. It allows for convenient generalizations, takes away the agency of the individual, replaces it with a systemic structure that the imperialist, the colonialist, whoever, the person in power can use to negotiate and set terms with. That the Jew is perceived to be distinctive in a social, political, and racial sense and is driven by an instinctive yearning for national redemption. It's characterized by Zionism, has to be seen within the wider context of racialist and nationalist thought in which Zionism sprung, and certain members of the British government derived on their own worldview. So on that, let's talk about the pre-existing biases of British officials.
Always fun.
Yes, indeed. So, 1 second here, my computer's acting a little slow. So we can make an argument, and this is borne out by Stein, that Zionism arose in the 1870s, 1860s, through the work of Leo Pritzker, later on by Theodor Herzl. This was predated by several decades by Henry Temple, also known as Lord Palmerston. He was a member of the Foreign Service with the British government. And in 1839 to 1841, he started leaning on the Ottoman Empire to accept the settlement of Jews, trying to frame that as being to the Ottomans' advantage. His efforts to facilitate Jews within the Holy Land preceded Herzl's work by over 50 years easily. This was the first documented positioning of the British government on the topic of a Jewish homeland or Jewish resettlement. And this was the foreign secretary of the British government. It was not like some some back office clerk who just was spouting his own views. This guy had a position of power and authority. When he talked, people listened. But he was ultimately unsuccessful. His representatives and directed attempts to intercede with the Turks on behalf of the Jews. Like I said, this is the first diplomatic attempt to intercede on behalf of the Jews. This continued on at fits and starts. This was not overarching British policy by any stretch of the imagination at this point in time, going all the way up through the 1890s into the 1900s. Sorry, there's just so much stuff here. This paper, I believe the original paper length was 25-30 pages. And you know how at first when you start writing, you're kind of despair that you're going to get close to that mark. Mm-hmm. And then by the end, I was kind of despairing because I had to cut it off at 35 and I could have easily done another 20 pages. I mean, there's just so much information on this topic. There's so much that's germane and relevant. It's hard to choose. It was hard to choose what to include and what to keep out. So this, like I said, this positioning of Palmerston's as far as advocacy for the Jews had small, trying to think of the right way to put it. There's a small contingent of people within British society, especially within the upper echelons in the government, that were supportive of this idea. There were Protestant policymakers within both Prussia and Britain who kind of championed this. A large part of this was based on religious beliefs. Direct quote is the fulfillment of prophecy by the return of the chosen people to the Holy Land. This circle of people was pretty small. You had Prussian representatives, Lord Palmerston himself, Lord Ashley, who was a leading member of the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews, which advocated for a core concept of what would become Christian Zionism. This was a major part of thinking among these people because sorry, this kind of wrapped up here for a second. Because this was a major part of their beliefs. You know, this is part of the anti-Semitism, is that they need to become like us. They need to be converted. This didn't take on a whole lot of traction, though. You know, we had different writers talking about it. Stein notes that most of these guys, they were little known and their voices didn't really carry very far. This continued on up through the beginning of solid advocacy for Zionism, where Theodor Herzl starts writing, Leo Pinsker starts writing. You have Zionist activists start crisscrossing Europe trying to find engagement with any national power at this point. It's not just the British by any means, to find some receptive ears to develop the ideas of a Jewish homeland. They started that, like I said, in the 1860s, 1870s. Herzl goes to London in 1895 to try and generate interest in his ideas. He later writes Der Judenstaat. He's hoping to create the infrastructure for a society of Jews from the contingent of English Jews and Maccabeans within England itself. This goes all the way up through 1902 when Herzl reaches out to Lord Nathan Meyer Rothschild on the possibility of a Jewish settlement in El Arish, excuse me. Basically, at this point, what he's trying to do is he's trying to say that, look, our interests align with what you want. You have interests in the region. You know, you're trying to fend off the French. You're trying to fend off the Germans. You're trying to prevent further incursions by these other colonial powers. Here's a way in which we can all work together on this. And that continued on. It just, you know, these guys were continually trying to reach out to the British, to the Germans. Herzl talks with Lord Cromer, the British agent in Cairo. They rejected afterwards the idea of El Harish because of the opposition from the Egyptian government. At that point, Lord Chamberlain suggests the idea of a Jewish settlement within Africa, and that becomes a possibility. This was later shot down by the colonists there themselves. It just becomes really, really unpopular, as one might imagine. This knocked out the official engagement by the British government with the Zionists till about 1908, 1909. It's too early.
Yeah. With that in mind, Zoom is telling me I've got, less than 5 minutes for this meeting. Upgrade to Pro.
They cut it down from an hour. Wow.
Yeah. So we can continue this in another form of recording. So how about we just make this as part 1, okay?
Sounds good. Yeah.
All right.
Do you want to edit here?
Yes. So
Okay.
I will. I'm Forrest.
Yeah. I'm Novelin.
Yeah.
All right, and for anyone who is listening, thank you for listening, and we will be back in part 2.